You are listening to the Down the Wormhole podcast, exploring the strange and fascinating relationship between science and religion. This week, we are exploring how that relationship gets worked out in real life with one of the current Sinai and Synapses fellows. Sinai and Synapses is a 2-year fellowship committed to elevating the discourse surrounding religion and science, and where the 5 of us first met. So, without further ado, our guest today is a Ph.D. student in the graduate program in religion at Boston University. He is a sociologist of religion and a health educator. His research interests focus on the social scientific study of religion, health-seeking behaviors, and faith-based health education and promotion. Welcome to the podcast, Tyler J. Fuller.
Hi, Zach.
Hi.
Glad to be here.
So wonderful to have you.
I'm glad to be here.
Those of you, listening at home, probably won't realize there has been a sizable gap since the last time that we have talked with a Sinai and Synapse fellow. So, if anything in the last episode sounds different than this episode, that's why it is. But it is so great to be back talking with the current fellows, especially talking with you, Tyler. We had tried to connect back in the summer, and summer just got away this year, didn't it?
It really did.
But you're a PhD student, so I feel like you don't get a break ever, do you?
No. I took a comprehensive exam on religion, health, and medicine at the end of May. And then in June, I started preparing for another comprehensive exam on religion and social theory that I took about a week and a half ago.
Oh, wow.
And that's just been my life.
So you're super excited to talk about religion even more then, right? I hope.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in looking at all that you are working on and talking with you a little bit and just reading your CV a bit, it seems that a lot of your research centers around this intersection of religion and health, or healthcare, or how people even define health. And that's not an intersection that I think a lot of our listeners are familiar with, or thought that deeply about, even though now looking at a couple of the things you've worked on, I think, wow, we should be talking a little bit more about this. Could you talk a little about how religion and healthcare inform each other and from your experience and from your research?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I have really been thinking about recently is Professor Linda Barnes, who's at Boston University also, wrote an article that to know all the ways that you can define a person is to know all the ways that they can become ill. And I think that that's so important for thinking about the ways that religion informs responses to illness, and both from doctors and healthcare providers and care seekers and their families. Because religion, for a lot of people, does a lot to tell them what it means to be human. It's not the only thing that can tell us what it means to be human, but it's a large part of that. An example I think about is if you think that a human being is just a body, it's just a biophysical body, then your response to healthcare is usually going to be to seek out a practitioner that does biophysical care solely, usually a biomedical doctor. But if you think that a person is a body and a spirit, well, then all of a sudden you have spiritual well-being that can be part of care and illness as well. And I think that sometimes what I've seen is that you have biomedical doctors and maybe like hospital chaplains who are understanding what it means to be a person differently and trying to provide care for a person from their own kind of definitions of what it means to be a person or what the most important part of personhood is. But then that bleeds out into some of my other interests, like how communities seek out health and well-being, and how you provide education about health and well-being.
One of the things that I found really interesting and somewhat disturbing. Last year at the Palmer Seminary's Science and Religion Symposium that I am the director of, we had Dr. Devin Stahl from Baylor out, and she was telling us that in her research they found that the group of people most likely to seek drastic, invasive, end-of-life care, like the kind that is just will reduce your quality of life significantly in order to try to save a life, are Christians who believe in the afterlife. And that felt backwards to me, right? Because we always say that, well, I know where I'm going when I die, and so I'm sure I'll be fine. And she said that as best as they could figure, it had something to do with belief in miracles. That if you believe in miracles, then you want to give God every chance you got. That extra 30 seconds of life might end up being a miracle, that we needed right then and there.
Yeah. Every procedure, every medication, every interaction, they become an opportunity in that kind of a worldview.
Yeah, and it seems like it put like the more a person believed in interventionary miracles, like if that's a part of what their religion taught, the less likely they were to really trust the opinions of a doctor who said, "All right, it's time we talk palliative." Do you find that there's a hindrance to healthcare with our religions overall, or is this something that has helped, do you think?
That's a great question. I think in some ways it depends how we define healthcare. So, because in the U.S., when we think of healthcare, we're usually thinking of biomedical healthcare. But there's so many other medical and healing systems around the world in different times and places. And I think sometimes in the U.S. we don't examine that as thoroughly in like the public sphere. We tend to think that biomedicine is medicine because it's the dominant form in the U.S.
Right.
And I often kind of think about what are the types of questions that thinking about biomedicine as true medicine hinders us from asking.
That's a great question. So what other kinds of healthcare? How else might a different society define healthcare?
So kind of going back to what I was saying before, like to know all the different ways that all the things that define what a person is to think about all the ways that they can become ill. In different places that emphasize something more like the spirit or the soul over the body, it makes more sense to do like spiritual approaches, or to do spiritual approaches first, and then if those don't work, to try something else.
Yeah, I'll admit I'm stuck in that kind of Western mindset where it's biomedical medicine is medicine and everything else is placebo, which just makes me an awful pastor, I think. I really probably shouldn't admit that, but do you think that this is a trend in the United States? That are we moving more towards now alternative forms of healing? I feel like I keep hearing a lot more about alternative forms and moving away from big pharmaceutical treatment plans. Are we correcting now, or is that just me imagining something?
So I think alternative forms of to biomedical intervention have always, kind of existed in U.S. and North American history. What I think is really interesting is why we don't remember that those things have existed in the past, or what is it about the world, the way the world is set up, the society is set up now, that we have so much more access maybe sometimes to hearing about these different forms. And I think part of it also is that certain forms that started as very religious or metaphysical have transitioned into seeking to be understood more biomedically. Chiropractic is an example of that. The original founder of the chiropractic practice, was thinking about aligning the spine to allow for the flow of divine energy within the body and how that would heal or promote well-being. And over the years, practitioners of chiropractic moved away from thinking about it as divine energy in the body to dealing with muscles and bones. So musculoskeletal approach that makes more sense within a biomedical framework. And to the point now where, from my understanding, is taught in chiropractic schools is like this is where we came from, but now we have all this scientific evidence on what was really happening. So some of the ways that we have sought to do alternative and complementary forms of healing and medicine have slowly inched more and more towards biomedicine. They've sought to be kind of recognized as just as legitimate forms of healing as biomedicine. And at times with like chiropractic, that meant moving closer to it or trying to understand itself in the language that biomedicine was using.
Or at least a rapidly secularizing society is using. Right? I think about the transition from meditation to mindfulness, of, incense as a spiritual practice to a multi-level marketing scheme.
Yes. Yeah, it's very interesting. I think about, too, the move from talking about religion to talking about spiritual well-being. I've done a little bit of archival research that suggests that it stems back to the White House Conference on Aging. And I'm forgetting exactly which year it was. Yeah, the first White House Conference on Aging, they had a panel on religion and aging. And then in the second or third iteration, I'm forgetting which one because it's been a few years since I've looked at these things, they switched it to spiritual well-being because they were afraid of getting told like that's not separation of church and state. So if we stop thinking of it as religion and start thinking of it as spirit, then the assumption was then it doesn't count. We don't have to worry about that divide, which I think is interesting because from like the religious studies, sociology of religion perspective, spirituality is often kind of seen as like a form of thinking about, like a form that religion takes.
Yes. Right. It's almost like the offensive part is religion. It's the bureaucracy. It's the names and the fancy hats of the whole deal. But it's the kind of intuitive spirituality is something that we want to keep without the rules and fancy hats.
Yeah, some of the mostly medical doctors who were involved in these early things, their assumption was, well, everyone has a spirit. So therefore we can talk about spiritual well-being, which again gets back to this whole idea of, does everyone have a spirit? In certain, it depends who you ask. Some people would say, nope, people are just a body. Some people would say, yes, people are primarily a spirit. Other people would say a person is a body and a spirit equally. All these different conceptions of what it means to be human.
Yeah, and it almost seems like when you talk about that kind of deal, like ask one of those people who's very sure about having a spirit, what a spirit is, and suddenly they can't define it anymore. It just...
Yes.
It's a thing.
I once, during my master's degree, I was taking a class on pastoral care and world religions. And
wait, like studying how different religions do pastoral care? Ooh.
And it was fascinating. I was the only non-master's in divinity degree candidate in the room. I don't think they knew quite what to do with this little budding sociologist of religion who was interested in healthcare. But I was really interested in the idea of like, can we think of health education in churches as pastoral care? Will that change how pastors think about it, or will they be more willing to engage in it? But during this class, we were talking about well-being and care and the concepts of physical well-being, mental well-being, social well-being, and spiritual well-being came up. And the professor asked us to think about how we would put these in concentric circles. Which one would be the smallest circle in the middle? Which one would be the biggest circle that kind of encompasses everything? And people were were going around the room sharing and talking about why they would think about things in certain places. And I said, well, I think that I would set mine up as a Venn diagram. And they all kind of looked at me like, what? And I was like,
I deny the premise of your question entirely. And, you are destined for PhD studies.
Right, I know. This is actually like days after I had gotten admitted to my PhD program at BU. And I said, well, I would think of one of the circles as mental well-being and emotional well-being, and the other circle as social well-being. And it seems to me that a lot of the things that we talk about in relation to examples of spiritual well-being kind of fit in the middle. If it's something like a sense of peace and calm, how is that different than mental well-being? If it's about relationships, spiritual figures within a tradition, I was like, is that not also somewhat social? Because it's about the relationship between two things. And the professor kind of looked at me and was like, I don't know how to deal with you trying to subvert this question like that.
They don't pay me enough.
But it kind of started this kick in me to think about, like, what is spiritual well-being? Yeah. I was like, because that was when I was like, okay, people are defining it. They're using this word. Are they all defining it the same way? Which is another, like, what they teach you your first semester in a PhD program is definitions matter. Two people might use the same word and be thinking of completely different things.
Oh my goodness, right? I mean, I have thought sometimes about these artificial divides between Christian denominations, because I'm Protestant and there's 10,000 of us. And I think, all right, is there really much of a difference between, say, me and the United Church of Christ and the Presbyterian down the street? Maybe between the clergy who have studied this. Mm-hmm. But I'll bet if you were to just look out in the congregation and you were to say, define God to everyone there, you would get such vastly, wildly different explanations that at the heart of our differences, it has nothing to do with what we believe about our religion. It has to do with, like, our belonging in a club.
Well, it's so interesting because you can see that there are certain trends or beliefs that aren't necessarily denominationally specific, but they kind of can carry across. The one I'm thinking about specifically is the idea of Christian nationalism. There's two sociologists of religion, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, that have been doing a lot of work on it. And they found that this concept is people across all different types of Christian denominations can assent to Christian nationalism, the idea that the U.S. should be a Christian nation. And it's not necessarily just people in one specific church, but people in one church might have completely different views on that, And that's really interesting. They also have some fascinating work that they put out at the start of COVID about how that concept relates to vaccine hesitancy and social distancing behavior.
Like one's propensity towards Christian nationalism affected their attitudes towards COVID measures.
Yeah. And I thought that was one of the most it was a really early study that they pushed out really, really quickly. And one that I kept sending to all my friends who work in public health now. And I was like, this is really important. It's not just a religion thing or a Christianity thing or even a liberal conservative Christianity thing. Part of what they said was that they found that people who assented to Christian nationalism were more statistically more likely to be vaccine hesitant. And this was before we even had a vaccine that was working, and were less likely to engage in social distancing behaviors, but that being Christian as a whole didn't actually mean that you were going to, and actually some Christian communities they were finding were more likely to do social distancing behaviors because they were using certain theologies that said, like, I should protect my neighbor and things like that.
Exactly. Think of the most vulnerable.
And so I kept sending this to people whenever somebody would say something like, oh, like, people who are religious aren't going to get the vaccine, or these, churches aren't doing social distancing. And I was like, actually, it's a lot more complicated.
Way more complicated. I have a church in my town that still hasn't started meeting.
Wow.
Like since March 13th of 2020, they have still not had an in-person service.
I'm working on finalizing a project right now I interviewed Catholics in Boston who watched Catholic Mass virtually. And within one congregation, the ways that people were understanding that experience were very different. All of them were engaging in social distancing practices. I think there was kind of some self-selection of people who were willing to respond to an advertisement placed in the church bulletin to do interviews with this random PhD student. They had something that they wanted to talk about.
Yeah, that's true.
Particularly, but the things that they were finding important were really interesting, because people who were really focused on the Eucharist, going back, like receiving the physical Eucharist, were really excited to go back to Mass. Like, they understood why they were social distancing at the time, but they were looking forward to going back in person. And some other people who thought maybe the readings or the preaching were the most important part were kind of content to watch Mass online. Some of them were like, can we keep doing this in the future? Because it takes me, 45 minutes to get from the suburbs into this church that I like,
Yeah.
And they thought it was.
Do you know if they're back taking the full Eucharist now?
No, I don't. It's one of those things I need to follow up on.
I went to my nephew's first communion a couple months ago, and they were doing the bread, but not the wine.
Okay. Yeah. Sometimes Catholics do that, because in the theology, you only really need one or the other. Some people will take both, but when push comes to shove, you only need one or the other. And it's this workaround that people who can't have gluten, will take just the wine, and theologically have participated in the whole Eucharist. A lot of where I grew up, very few people took the wine. It seemed like, especially when I was young in Catholic school, almost no one would take the wine, because our parents were all like, it doesn't taste great. Trying to steer us away from it, I guess. So
it's so interesting to me how our behaviors are kind of created by our doctrine.
Yeah.
But then our doctrine can then get shifted based on the needs of the moment, based on our what has to happen now, and that the two are constantly in dialogue with each other. We're explaining why this is okay now through some interpretation of Scripture that we had to come up with now because there's a need, and we've been doing that forever. Right? I mean, that's the whole birth of the rabbinic movement, is that there's no more temple. How do we make sacrifice? Our lives are sacrifices. Right?
Yeah. Everything is a response to something else. There's a sociology of constructivism, where the society that you're in gives you these ways of being in the world. But then if something changes, or doesn't change, you put your actions back out into society, and they either reinforce how things are and it continues, or if there's a necessitated change, they change it in some way, and then that changes and then acts on people in new ways, and it just kind of is this cycle that keeps going.
I like that. It feels alive.
It's always changing. Nothing's ever quite static.
Well, that's true. That's a part of what it means to be human, right? Never changing. I mean, always changing. Never staying still. The opposite of that. So what got you into this field, this dialogue?
How much time do you have? No, I'm kidding.
25 minutes.
25 minutes. Um, I was an undergraduate student, and I was set on going to medical school. And I had taken a few religion classes to fulfill general education requirements, and because I liked one of the professors. And after my junior year of college, I started shadowing some doctors in one of the local hospitals, which I think every pre-med student should do, because I realized I didn't want to do what they did every day for my career.
That's brilliant. You saw it and you were like, nah, it's not for me.
I realized I was like, I'm more attracted to the idea of continuously learning and engaging in knowledge. And I think that I was like, if I want to do those things, I got to go to school. So I made a shift, and my advisor, so then I also started taking more religion classes to kind of balance out the biological sciences I was doing. And my advisor was like, well, there's lots of ways you can do work in health, you know? She was like, you should look into public health. So I did. And I was a Peace Corps volunteer for 2.5 years in Fiji, in the islands. And while I was there, I was doing community health education and community health promotion through water infrastructure projects, which I'm not a specialist in. Luckily, somebody else in my community was. So I learned how to write a grant application, though.
Well, that's important.
Yeah. But I realized as I was living there and doing work, and half the time, I was always working with the church in some way. Even times when I didn't necessarily intend to start working with the church, we would be doing fundraising or something for a project, and they'd be like, you know, and then it would come out, oh, well, this fundraising from the church, or, oh, you know, we organized this, you know, gathering these supplies or doing this work, you know, at the women's group that's sponsored at the church or something like that. And I was thinking about just the way that the church was so woven into the community that I was working in and living in. And I found out that Emory University had a dual master's degree program in religion and public health.
Oh.
And so I got a master's of theological studies and a master's of public health concurrently. And that was what started me down this road.
Wow. Well, it's really needed. Thank you. I think you maybe picked the right field when it comes to public health. Turns out we need more public health officials because they're all quitting.
Well, and one of the things I really loved about doing my 2 master's degrees together was it made me read public health literature on like church-based health education a little more critically, where I realized that there were some points where I was reading, I was like, I think I need to be asking new questions about this that I haven't learned how to ask yet. And then I went back to the School of Theology, to my religious studies professors, and they helped me shape how to ask these types of questions that I was interested in, where I was able to kind of move beyond just what is church attendance? Does going to church more frequently associate with having this or that, you know? And I got to the point where I started to be able to think, what are the narratives that people in religious communities are using, and how is that impacting how they're understanding health or offering health education? And it felt so needed to have that kind of being able to ask new questions.
That's the beauty of academia right there.
Yeah.
Right? You go looking for answers, and all you find is better questions.
Exactly. And I think that's where they get you with interdisciplinary work. They kind of like it's like the witch in Snow White, where she's like, apple. They're like, take this.
Here is truth.
They're like,
gotcha.
Yeah, they're like, would you like
more questions?
Would you like to take this one interdisciplinary class? And then you're like, sure, that could be a fun elective. And then you just tumble down this rabbit hole, and 5 years later, you're in a PhD program, not sure what way is up and what way is down.
Right. You find yourself on some archaeological dig site somewhere, and you're like, how did I get here?
Exactly.
I was supposed to be a veterinarian.
Exactly. I was like, when I was in high school, I was supposed to end up being a medical doctor. And now, I sit around interviewing people about what it was like going to mass online, and if during a pandemic. Life takes you funny ways.
Oh my goodness, don't I know it? So you mentioned the interdisciplinary work, and you had said earlier, before we started talking, that one of the things you're really interested in is bringing religious literacy education into public health spaces and vice versa. I'm more familiar with the vice versa, right? The bringing healthcare initiatives and education into religious circles and introducing them to things, don't be afraid of the doctor and get the vaccine and stuff like that. But the other way around of bringing religious literacy education into public health spaces, what does that look like? So
it's this new kind of concept I've been playing with because I got the opportunity to work with Professor Stephen Prothero at BU, who has written a book on religious literacy, and this kind of idea that there's just certain kind of basic things about different religious traditions that we should know, or know enough about to ask respectful questions and engage in respectful, stimulating dialogue. And he teaches that with his undergraduate students. He has an assignment where they take a religious literacy quiz at the end of the semester, where they're just kind of, there's certain things that are basic questions, like what is the primary text within Islam? And kids are supposed to know it's the Quran. But he also asks them certain things like, George Bush referenced the Jericho Road in his inaugural speech. What is that a reference to? Why is it important that the president of the United States made a biblical reference in his inaugural speech? To think about the ways that these images and narratives from different traditions seep into the public. But also, like, if you don't know what he's referencing, you might interpret that part of his speech very differently.
Yeah.
And I love these.
That's the Good Samaritan, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And I saw Professor Prothero do this with his students, and it made me think about that was kind of some of these ideas that I was just trying to get a grasp on in my master's program with these interdisciplinary work. And I was like, I think what I would really like to do someday is go back to public health spaces and do some of this kind of work and think about, like, what are some of the basic things that somebody in public health needs to know about religion in order to engage in some of these questions and think about some of these things. And I think it that answer to that question varies on what type of work they do. If they are an epidemiologist who is interested in gathering data about how religion or religious denomination affects, mortality rates, there's a lot to unpack there. And maybe that's kind of more of let's think about what's the definition of religion, or the fact that religious studies scholars don't agree on a definition of religion. But on the other hand, if it's somebody who is getting an MPH from a Department of Global Health, who wants to work in, say, nonprofit sector or the NGO sector internationally, then I think, there is something that's important for them to know about have a base knowledge of the different religious traditions in the community and the country that they're going to work in, and a little bit of knowledge about what is pluralism. How does that affect things? Sometimes it's easy to go into a new space and kind of be like, well, let's talk to the dominant tradition, or something like that. But I think it's important to think about this who is where, what are the different traditions, what is the base kind of things that I need to know about this tradition so that I can ask the appropriate questions.
Yeah, that's a great point. You can no longer just assume you walk into a hospital room and the person is some kind of Christian in the United States. You probably should not have assumed that in the past either, but it's more important now than ever before. And I guess you're really interesting point about how you even define a religion, because when you go to those checkboxes of, what's your religious affiliation, I always see Buddhism on there, and that's not a religion according to the Buddhists that I know. And yet it kind of checks a lot of the boxes of religion, even without the deity. Do you have a good working definition of religion, religion scholar?
I do not. And actually, one of the things that I think is really important is, so one of the things is the problem with defining religion is either that you're going to leave out something that most people would kind of conventionally consider to be a religious tradition, or you're going to make it so broad that you can include tons of things that we wouldn't normally. Like there are set example of this is there is a really kind of fun, playful article about what if we think about baseball as religion, and kind of goes through
You're in Boston.
I am in Boston, so there is that. And so that's the problem is like sometimes you get religious definitions that are so broad that they don't become useful. And I think one of the things that I've learned over my graduate school career is that oftentimes it's important to select the definition or the theory that helps you answer the question at hand. And this is something that public health people talk about too in health education. There's many different theories of health education and health behavior. And when I was taking my first theory seminar on that, the professor told us, some of these tend to work better for certain things than other things. There's some that work really well for one-time interventions, getting somebody to get, say, a COVID-19 booster shot or a flu shot. And then there's other ones that work better for thinking about kind of daily activities, like how do you increase somebody's fruit and vegetable intake or their activity on a daily or weekly basis. Health educators would know instinctively that you should use different theories or approaches for those because there's just ones that tend to work better. And I think that the same thing kind of applies to religious studies. The question depends on what question you want to ask. If you want to ask something about, say, purity rituals and how maybe menstrual rituals affect women's health, well, you probably want to go with Mary Douglas because her theory of religion or her work on religion thinks about purity and purity rituals. If you want to think about something more institutional, like how does the Catholic Church make rules about your doctrine about contraception, then you might want to use Durkheim, who thought a lot about institutions. And I think that that's really important for anyone thinking about religion and public health to think about is if there's no perfect theory of religion, just like there's no perfect theory of health behavior, then the task of the researcher or the practitioner, maybe not even always the researcher, sometimes just the person who, a public health educator is their job, is picking the tools that are the most helpful at the moment. So yeah, that's something I'm really interested in. And I think that's part of why I'm in a religious studies program for my PhD I thought it was really important to kind of get these deeper understandings of what is religion, how does it work, what are the different ways to think about it.
Do you see examples, like good, helpful examples of doctors and administrators working alongside their spiritual care departments? They're bringing in their chaplains to help educate the healthcare professionals as well?
I know there are. Admittedly, I'm not as current on hospital chaplaincy. But a similar example that I think is really important and interesting is the last really big Ebola outbreak that we had. You had all these health educators that went in and were like, here's how you should be preparing corpses after somebody has died from Ebola or died, or you don't know what their death cause was because you don't know if it could be Ebola or not. And people were not very receptive to that. But they started working with some of the local religious leaders and faith leaders who, one, explained some of the reasons that they do burials the way that they do them, but also helped in framing communication messages for the public, as well as spreading them, not just the framing, but also like the putting them out into the community. And that worked much more effectively. And so I think that, especially some around these very sensitive and important religious topics, especially around something like life and death, that part of partnership in thinking about how do we mitigate the risk of disease transmission while also understanding what is going on religiously here and what religious commitments need to be made, because somebody might say it's more important for me to engage in this religious practice than it is for me to worry about Ebola at the moment. So it's that how do people negotiate that? And I think that's the important partnership between biomedical doctors and then religious leaders.
Yeah, I've found personally there's a large gap between theory and practice when it comes to religious settings. There's just a lot of things that I thought before I became a pastor, and then having done it for years, I realized like, wow, this theory is practically useless because I need to be looking at this from a totally different perspective from somebody who is currently suffering, somebody who's currently in pain, who's not thinking rationally. They're not thinking about public health right now. They're thinking, they're feeling so deeply the loss of this loved one and their eternal lives. And there's all these other things going on there that, maybe there's more of an art than a science to some of the people relations that go on.
It's kind of that thing of like, we talk a lot about how biomedical doctors need bedside manner. Sometimes I think public health practitioners also need a certain level of bedside manner.
Who's really great at this is somebody who was a fellow last year, the Sinai and Synapses, KCB NMA. She is a spiritual care director at Lincoln Hall Hospital. She started a program similar with connecting the doctors and the chaplains together. I believe the details are a little fuzzy in my mind. It was episode 71, if anyone wants to listen, and then send me a letter saying that's not at all what it was about. But if memory serves me, we talked a lot about the practicality of providing the best healthcare on the ground to people who are currently suffering and perhaps not thinking what we might call rationally in the moment. So, Tyler, at the end of our time together, I like to ask all of the fellows a super easy question that you shouldn't have to think at all about. That being, if there was one thing that you could tell the entire world, if there was one thing that you wish every single person knew, what would it be?
I shouldn't have to think about this one, huh?
Like, in the Matrix where Neo's just like, whoa, I know Kung Fu. Because they put it into his brain.
Okay.
Like that kind of deal. You can just zap one thing into everyone's brain in the world. What's it going to be?
I'm going to go with how to swim.
How to swim? Okay. You need to unpack that one a little bit for me.
Look, you asked me for something off the top of my head. And
I'm into it. This is the best answer so far. Go ahead.
I was a lifeguard for 9 years, and I taught swimming lessons for that whole time. And so swimming is something, I think it's, as much as it's fun, it's also an important safety skill. So that's something I've always thought is important to learn.
We could probably save a lot of lives if everyone just instinctively knew how to swim. That is an excellent public health answer.
I'm glad you like it.
That I think that might be one of my favorite answers so far. Well, thank you, Tyler, for your enthusiasm, your interest, the work that you're studying and doing. So much blessings on you and this next period of your PhD, and the ridiculous amounts of work that it will take. But it'll be great. It'll be worth it. This is such necessary work that you're doing. So thank you for doing it, and thank you for spending the last 45 minutes with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.